Okay. So let me begin with Cincinnatus's question about the COVID virus. My position on the COVID virus is very straightforward. That the quarantine we are currently engaged in, the lockdown, so to speak, especially at least in America, represents everything that's wrong with the way we make policy decisions and the way we reason or fail to do so. And what I mean by this is that, yes, it's true, COVID's a new virus, it's unusually contagious. But when we decided on this initial quarantine lockdown thing, we were told originally that it didn't transmit airborne, it was by touch and stuff, which somewhat justified the keeping people away from each other. Uh-oh. Am I in trouble, Amber Drescher? Hey, I had a rough time of it. Okay, I had a rough time with it with Kimberly. It was difficult as hell. So anyway, regarding COVID, if you look at the actual stats, first of all, the question is, what ought our response be, and how much ought it deviate from a normal comparative response? So we know that we can expend resources to presumably save lives, increase safety, prevent death, prevent harm, whatever. The question is how many resources and how much imposition on everybody. So the bottom line is this. To the extent that this particular virus justifies extreme measures, it justifies individuals taking extreme measures based on their own specific needs. They're a high-risk population, have pre-existing conditions, or elderly, then they probably should self-isolate during this because they're at unusually high risk. But if we look at the stats and compare it to a flu season, we realize this is no different at all. In fact, it's better. In Italy, where we've got the most sort of concentrated deaths, you're looking at literally the stats show 99% of the people who died from it are over 75. 50% of the people who died from it have 3 or more pre-existing conditions. So this is not a deadly virus we're talking about. And it's a kind one in that we don't just have to consider the amount of lives saved or not saved. We also have to consider the total number of lives saved. So in other words, a pandemic that kills young people would be considerably more concerning than one that kills the elderly primarily. Now, that's not to say young people don't die from this. There are some young people that die, all of whom basically have significant pre-existing conditions. So the question then is, how can we respond to this appropriately? And the answer is not like this. First of all, the quarantine was implemented before people had any accurate data on the matter. And it's always a bad decision. You can't use ignorance to justify either side of the position. Well, we don't know how bad it's going to be, so let's do X. Not an argument. Not an argument that stands any muster at all, because what we see is when we use that argument, we do massive amounts of harm, as we are now, without actually attaining any benefits. The reason we're not attaining any benefits is because the purported benefits are to flatten the curve, to slow the progression of the illness from pockets to worldwide pandemic. Here's some problems with that notion. Number one, what's to stop the virus from just simply breaking out again after the quarantine? I've heard answers ranging from, well, it'll be quarantine until a vaccination. Well, what if it's not possible to vaccinate this? Or what if the vaccine is years away? So we can't sort of predicate a return to normalcy on the arrival of a vaccine because we don't know if there's ever even going to be a vaccine. I've heard that, well, obviously we're going to squash it out if we have a long enough quarantine. Okay, that's assuming everybody stays basically where they're supposed to be. But the fact is, this is not a real quarantine. I'm going to the supermarket every day. So is everybody else. The other day I went to Foster's Freeze. Across the street, a music instrument store was closed, as is all kinds of stores like that, all around. But the fast food restaurants are open. I'm still talking to people at the window. They're still going home and dealing with their people. If it's airborne, I'm still potentially transmitting it. It's not clear how many people in America have already had it and have immunity now. That's not clear. Nobody's testing for that. The only people being tested are the most sick people. The fatality rate's like 0.2%. And the impacts, the negative impacts, are so massive that you have to say, okay, well, What is it about COVID that makes it so special that requires us to take this extreme response? And the most anybody can say is a large number of deaths. Let's say 1 million worldwide. 1.25 million people die each year in America alone in car crashes. So why wouldn't we ban cars and driving? If this logic is good enough, right? And the answer is, of course, well, because we can't end our entire way of life and way of being just to make sure that nobody ever gets hurt or dies. We have to place some of that individual responsibility on the individuals who potentially are at risk. So, if somebody's a chronic drunk driver, we might take extra steps to make them put a breathalyzer before they drive, take away their driver's license entirely or whatever, right? Okay, well, it's true that car accidents aren't contagious. That's true. So what you're saying is what? That the 1.25 million deaths a year are okay? Now, remember, the contagious part of COVID means you're not actually going to prevent anybody from getting it. You're just going to have them get it later. If they were going to die from it, they were going to die anyway, probably. 80% of people on ventilators, the number one treatment for it, die. 80% of people who get treated with a ventilator die anyway. Now, note that this whole, well, we have to not overwhelm the healthcare system. There won't be enough ventilators. It doesn't make any fucking difference. The people who get it bad enough to die tend to die. And they tend to have lots of pre-existing conditions and be very, very old. Thank you, Cincinnatus. So, in other words, what is the actual justification here for shutting down the world economy, creating a depression, making millions of people homeless, making millions of people's quality of life go down, resulting in countless suicides from the added isolation, mental health problems, societal problems of all sorts, the destruction of a civil society, at least temporarily. So, so Pate Wynn says the potential death of a contagious virus can be in the millions if unregulated. Okay, so remember, the potential death of a contagious virus can be in the millions. That's true, whether or not it's quote unquote regulated. So we've already had 100,000 deaths from COVID, okay, this year so far. No, in the same 2 months, we've had 250,000 flu deaths. Now, you might say the only reason we don't have 250,000 COVID deaths is because of these measures we've taken. My point would be, okay, fine. So you shut down the world economy because of a flu, right? We don't do that normally. What makes this so special? Thank you very much, Cincinnatus. Thank you to Amber Drasher, of course, again, as well. And I appreciate that you enjoyed that video on the BPD thing. The majority of people are not going to pay the rent for April, like they actually went online and agreed with each other not to. Of course, the banks are still going to demand the mortgage payment from the landlord. So what's the landlord going to do? Is he not going to pay the bank? And then the bank not going to foreclose on the property? I mean, we always have periodic pandemics, be they flu, be they other things. Is it nature's response? I don't know about that. I don't think that's really a relevant question. What I will say is this. Because it's contagious the way it is, and because there's a long incubation period, and because 80% of people who get it have basically no symptoms, the notion that we're going to successfully shut it down with the quarantine is absurd. We have no idea where it's actually rampaging across the country right now or not. No, it's not at all like saying, why don't we get rid of murder laws? Faith, when? Not at all. Not remotely, because a murder law punishes injustice. This quarantine creates injustice. A murder law says if you impose your position on somebody else so much as to kill them, then you are guilty of murder. What I'm saying is if you impose your position so much on everybody in the world that you destroy lives, then you're guilty of that. And that's what everybody's advocating in favor of this quarantine is doing. There's no logic to it, right? Nobody's ever explained to me what's going to stop this thing from simply erupting again as soon as we end the quarantine. Nobody has answered that question. I've heard a vaccination. It doesn't exist yet. That's it. So why then do we treat it so differently from other things that have equivalent death rates like the yearly flu? In 2015 in Italy, they had the same number of deaths they do in 2020, which is about 10% higher than normal for the month. Why did they have the same deaths in 2015, about 10% higher than normal for February, March? Why is the same 2 months, same about increased number of deaths in that year as this year? Why is it the same in Italy? Because in 2015, there was a flu spike. We didn't shut down the world economy. We didn't even shut down Italy. Italy didn't even shut down Italy. Italy tried to figure it out after the fact. Why was there so much more deaths in this months? That's how we normally do things. Because old people die, obviously. They die of something. Well, okay, Cincinnati, here's the thing. It makes no sense what they are doing. They are not stupid people, therefore there is another agenda at play. I don't think so. I think it is, in fact, a group of world health professionals who are going to obviously articulate the epidemiologist's perspective of, if everything, if all you have the hammer, everything's a nail. Well, what is the virus expert going to say? Oh, this virus is bad. It's going to be very contagious, it's going to spread, so we should do things to stop it. And then it's up to the rest of us sane adults to go, okay, I know that's your specialty, but just because, you teach elementary Spanish doesn't mean everything in life boils down to Spanish, Remember, we're not regulating a contagious virus. That's not what we're doing. We're forcing people to not work. We're not keeping people at home. People still going to supermarkets, people still spreading it if it's that contagious, for sure. So wouldn't you be immoral forcing people to lose their homes and jobs without any benefit at all you've articulated? Any way we can actually believe this is going to help at all? Wouldn't you be the immoral one? After all, the harms are certain. People lose their jobs, people lose their homes, people lose their quality of life. The whole fabric of civil society is shut down. The harms are clear and definitive and certain. Now, what benefits are you attaining, Figland, that justify those harms? And are you willing to go to each of those people's houses and tell them, you have to be homeless now because I'm worried about the COVID virus? I mean, if in fact it is the case that wickedness is not taking this extreme action, then every single year we are wickeder than we are with COVID because the flu kills more people. So why don't we apply your logic to anything else, Fate Wind? Why don't you care about anybody except for old people who get a virus? You don't seem to care about anybody else at all. You're willing to force everybody to stay home. You're willing to force everybody out of their house into homelessness. You're willing to force people into mental health problems because of isolation. Okay, you want me to take the pro-quarantine position? I'm going to have to lie, basically. I have to bullshit. I have to say, the strongest argument in favor of it is that I guess the scarring of the lungs. The thing about COVID that makes it uniquely dangerous, that justifies this uniquely disproportionate response, is that not only does it kill people, but the people it leaves alive, it scars their lungs and harms their respiratory systems from that point forward. The initial reports that it was just affecting old people were false. In fact, it affects people of all ages. It's just most of the younger people don't die. That doesn't mean they aren't permanently harmed by this thing because they have lung scarring. Now, obviously, if we're going to have a whole generation of people with respiratory problems, and we can shut that down in advance and prevent those kind of healthcare costs, and we'll probably even prevent a few deaths in the process. At least we'll push them later on into the season. We'll avoid any possible rush on the hospitals, which may or may not matter. But the point is, regardless, it's the long-term damage to young people that's concerning here that justifies this. There's no other equivalent there. In other words, the flu doesn't cause this kind of long-term lung damage. Common cold doesn't. SARS did, but SARS wasn't nearly as contagious. And with the long incubation period, we need to lock people, separate them as much as possible in hopes that you at least have pockets clear of the thing or filled with just immune people. We're not going to entirely eradicate it, but it's nevertheless worth it given the long-term health costs considered by the damage done by the COVID virus. That's the fairest, best, most correct possible argument you can make in favor of the quarantine. The potential death and lives ruined are far greater due to shutting down the economy than the random chance of you getting the virus. Well, I mean, I agree with you. Even arguing the other side, I have to agree with you, Lynn, that the quarantine is going to kill a lot of people. It's going to make a lot of people homeless. But if you look at the long-term costs, we can remedy that in shorter order than we can sustain the costs long-term of lung damage for a whole generation of people. So it's like, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't, right? We're not actually going to meaningfully save a lot of lives by doing this quarantine, but we might save a lot of healthcare costs down the road. And that those healthcare costs might outweigh the temporary economic costs of the quarantine in the long term. I am playing devil's advocate, Pete. In other words, I'm doing a good job of being devil's advocate. I'm not using bullshit arguments. I'm using the only good arguments that are on that side. I'm not going to lie and be deceptive and be married to my position at all costs. I'm going to argue it as best I can without being deceptive. So we do have to argue something other than lives saved, because that's not a metric that makes any sense, obviously. Because we could save millions more lives in just about any other way would be a more efficient way of saving lives than this. This is the least efficient way to save any lives you could possibly ever come up with. So we can eliminate the possibility of saving lives as the determining factor here. If you want to win the pro-quarantine side, you're going to have to come up with some other kind of impacts, because that's not an impact you actually have in the real world. You've not established it anyway. You've not shown me how any lives are saved. Nobody has. Nobody's shown me how this doesn't just erupt again as soon as the quarantine's over, or why it's not still erupting currently and we're just not noticing it because it's not that bad. Right. Grocery stores are plenty safe, right? Also, it's perfectly safe to go to the fast food place and walk in and go up to the counter and order your food and get it and take it out of the place. But you cannot stay in there and eat it. Also, it's perfectly safe to go to some places during the daytime, but at nighttime, for some reason, the virus is more deadly or something. What? For example, in California here, I can't go park at the beach because the beach parking lots are closed. But when on Saturday I went to Castaic Lake Lagoon, their parking lot was open, and there were a lot of people there fishing and in boats and stuff. Why? Because Castaic Lagoon is part of the parking lot thing, is part of the city or county there, not the state. So this is the insanity. Some people are being abundantly, massively harmed. Other people not harmed at all. And the reason? Completely arbitrary. There's no justification for massively harming Joe while not bothering Bob at all. What's my solution? We talk about it in the right way. We talk about where the burdens lie. Who has the burden to avoid health risks? The people who are at risk, not everybody else, obviously. People are always justifying concentrated harm for diffuse good. Like, well, we're going to tax the fuck out of this rich person, but we're going to spread it around so it's going to be diffuse good. So even if it's unfair to the rich person, it's okay. In this instance, everybody's doing the utterly insane thing of justifying diffuse harm for concentrated good. What? That's just idiotic. Neither thing is really justified. The diffuseness or concentration of the thing isn't where justifications come from. But any sane human being can tell you this, that there's no possible world in which it can be appropriate to justify diffuse harm for concentrated good. You're hurting a bunch of people to help a few. That's not okay. So we have, it's simply a matter of talking about this correctly and eliminating those courses of action, which are wicked, wrong, ill-advised, and not thought through enough. This policy was implemented in the absence of data, not in response to meaningful data. That's always fucking stupid. Why? Because Ignorance doesn't side with either side. Well, we don't know what this virus is going to do, Eric, so we shouldn't do anything in response to it then, obviously, until we do know. Thank you, Matthew, for clarifying that for everybody. Yeah, if the virus will mug you at night. During the day, it just gets you sick, but at night, it steals your wallet too. I mean, it's true. As I said at the beginning of this, the initial view on this disease was that it mostly only killed old people. And in fact, in Italy, that's been the case. In Italy, 99% of people who died, I'm not exaggerating this number at all, 99% are over 75. 50% of the deaths are over 80 with 3+ pre-existing conditions. Now, is it true that some young people died? Yes, mostly those with compromised immune systems. And that's where I get back to my central thesis, which is who has the burden? It's not everybody. It's the people. If I'm allergic to peanuts, it's my burden not to eat a Snickers, not the world's burden to get rid of Snickers bars. After all, things with peanuts in them kill a lot of people each year. Why don't we ban them? Oh, because people can make their own choices. That's right. Because people can entertain their own risk calculus and make decisions for themselves. Now, it's a lot easier to make real decisions when you have real information, because right now, everything's being spun so hard in favor of this catastrophe of a bad idea called the quarantine that that people like Fate Wind and whoever else is in here arguing in favor of the quarantine are just completely oblivious. They have no idea what they're arguing for. They don't realize that this thing is going to kill half as many people as an average flu in an average year. They don't care. They don't compare against anything and say, okay, is this a reasonable response based on our normal responses to things? Why do we not ban car driving? It kills over 1 million people a year. Well, because we understand the fact that living freely involves some risk, and that's okay. You see, the thing is, I don't think Trump wants anything to do with this mess. The problem that Trump had is he was correct in the first place, but he couldn't justify it because his explanation was he had a hunch. That's not a justification for anything. So, it's an incredibly selfish first world deal we got going on here, where people with good jobs and good educations and a nice nest egg who can preserve themselves over this indefinite quarantine are all like, oh, yes, we should do this. It's wonderful. It's going to save lives. And all the people they're harming are poorer than them. How come moderators get to see my messages? I cannot sleep. How come moderators get to see my messages? I don't know what you mean. You don't know that you're infected for about 2 weeks after contacting the virus. I know. Exactly. That's why that's the point, Baitland. Because of its uniquely contagious nature, the long incubation period, the high rate of contagion, the lack of immunity, that's why you're not going to be able to establish any actual impacts. You're going to kill the economy. As soon as you're done killing it and you can't kill it anymore, the virus is going to pop right back up. Either that or it's already spread and we have immunity. But remember, we don't know because nobody's doing the testing necessary to make these decisions properly, right? So we're making decisions in the absence of data rather than in response to real data. And that's a huge problem. We're guaranteed to be wrong almost every time if we do that. As we were this time, for sure. There's no disputing that. So the thing is, you don't apply your own argument to your own situation. So in other words, the reason why you say we need the quarantine is also the reason why the quarantine won't work, but you ignore that part. Have you established any mechanism by which we're actually going to shut the shit down? What is to stop it from re-erupting when the quarantine's over? Explain that to me, Big Wind. You don't have an explanation because you haven't thought about it. You haven't done any kind of real calculation as to whether it's a good idea or not. Yeah, I mean, the damages from this long term are going to vastly outweigh any possible benefits you can possibly establish. No, listen, Fate Wind, this is the same argument I had with Bluebird last night. You've got to think, Fate Wind. You've got to be honest and think. Now, you knew when you were advocating for this quarantine in the first place that Trump was the president. You advocated for it in that status quo. So that means if you want to be a serious advocate for anything, you need to account for that when making your advocacies. Well, maybe my advocacy would work, says a smart Fate Wind, except I'm not going to make it because I'm aware Trump's not going to follow through on his part that I need him to do. That would be a smart advocacy. And you'd be aware of considerations. But you went ahead and made your advocacy knowing you didn't like Trump, knowing that that the healthcare system was what it was, knowing that you weren't going to have any impacts. Maybe you didn't know that. You didn't think about it. You didn't care. But you made your advocacy anyway, without any kind of calculation that would have told you, oh shit, this is a bad idea, given the status quo that I'm advocating in. You don't get to advocate in make-believe Fate Win status quo. You have to advocate in the actual status quo, where things are real. This is the problem with the quarantine advocates. There's been nothing like it in history, not in recent memory, in history. Now, here are some circumstances. We know this is bullshit because we can come up with some circumstances in which we would want to do this. Let's say it had a fatality rate of 10%. Let's say it had a fatality rate of 7%, but killed mostly young people. We can't just count lives. We have to count number of years of lives saved. If you're 89 with 3+ existing conditions and you die, how many years of life have we actually saved? Maybe 6 months? No, I'm saying, Fate Wind, you're making the advocacy that we should do this shit in the status quo that you have. Now, if in fact the reason your plan isn't working is because Trump's not being cooperative, you should have thought about that before making your advocacy in the first place. You don't get to make an advocacy in a make-believe land where everything goes exactly how Fate Wind thinks it's going to go without actually considering real impacts, what you can establish, any kind of harms, benefits calculus, any kind of significance calculus, any kind of comparison against equivalent responses or lack thereof to equivalent problems. There's none of that happening. That's your failure. As an advocate, as a human being, you are forcing this shit. You and people like you are forcing this shit on everybody. This is the problem with your FI in charge here. You're thinking from your own selfish perspective, but lives are important to me. But other people's lives aren't important to you at all. Just the kind of lives you want to save. Everybody else's life is completely worthless to you. Just trash you throw out the window. You don't care about what other people think, want, feel, need. You don't care that the shutdown of things is completely unfair and arbitrary and guarantees this thing won't work. You don't care. Just the theater of health safety is good enough for you to cost us all so much. Shame on you. Well, good for them. They live with the elderly. Fine. I'm not advocating for Asia, okay? I'm advocating for what the U.S. should do. Do I think Asia should follow suit with what I think the U.S. should do? Sure, but it's not my road. I'm not going to bother advocating for multiple sovereign states. I'll advocate what the United States policy should be because I'm a United States citizen. And should we be doing this incredibly stupid misadventure and buttfuckery? No, we shouldn't. Absolutely not. In no sane world should we. No, Fate Wind, again. Remember, the problem is you don't have a solution, but we're paying trillions of dollars for your non-solution. That's the problem here. You're the one advocating a course of action that costs trillions of dollars, but doesn't save any lives. So why are you doing that, is my point. Why are you advocating for that? Hey, Azrael, you weren't listening either, apparently. So remember, 80% of people who are treated with ventilators die anyway. 80%. In other words, if you've got it that bad and those pre-existing conditions that you have is that bad, you're probably going to die anyway. Listen, Azrael, remember what I just said and pay attention to it. 80% of people receiving full blast maximal medical treatment for this thing die anyway. That is true, Azrael. That is true. I will find the quote for you. I'll find the data. It is true that 80% of people on respirators die anyway. Now, remember, this beautiful treatment called respirators, this was why we had to do this so badly. It's because why? Because otherwise hospitals would be overwhelmed, and then nobody would be able to get their respirators they need. Oh, that's right, they don't work anyway. Dum-dums. Hospitals report unusually high death rates for patients with ventilator coronavirus, and some doctors fear the patients may be damaging. I mean, the machines may be damaging patients. In New York City, 80% or more of the coronavirus patients placed on the machines have died, state and city officials say. And generally speaking, at least 40 to 50% of the patients on ventilators will die in general. That is not for coronavirus, but just in general. So we're looking at a thing that in Wuhan, the Chinese city where the disease arose, 86% of the people on ventilators died. Ventilators can harm the patient over time as high pressure oxygen enters the small air sacs in the patient's lungs. Mechanical ventilation is not benign. Medical ventilation can worsen lung injury. In the Spanish flu. I mean, those machines. What are we doing this for? Why are we doing this? To prevent the rush on the hospitals because we're going to need to have enough ventilators for people? You mean those machines that kill people? No, Fate Wind, I don't. Here's the deal. Well, not the same thing at all as Spanish influenza. Because one of the key things that everybody keeps ignoring and nobody answers my question is given the specifics of the contagiousness of this particular COVID virus, which is much more so than the Spanish flu and much more devious than the Spanish flu because the 14-day-long incubation period, listen, MJ, listen, remember, not the same thing. Whereas the lockdown could have worked on Spanish influenza, and in the few places where they had such a lockdown, it did work. It can't work here. Why? Because of the nature of the symptoms, the symptom list. Hold on. Remember, Fate Wind, we're addressing this point directly. We're actually being serious and honest now. We're not bullshitting, okay? So no bullshit this time. You need to stop bullshitting. Just be honest here. Now, remember, what's the big difference between the Spanish flu and this? There's a couple of big differences. One, Spanish flu, a vastly higher fatality rate. Number one, okay, vastly higher. So a lot more reason to actually quarantine. Remember, the fatality rate of this is 0.2% or lower, which is much lower than even the mildest flu. So the other big difference, though, is the incubation period and the fact that most people who get it don't have any symptoms. So it's guaranteed to re-erupt this virus epidemic after the quarantine's over. In fact, it's currently still re-erupting because there's no actual shutdown happening. So If, in fact, there's any successful stopping of this virus, it's because of everyone wearing masks, not because of the shutdown. Because it's asymptomatic, 14-day incubation period, and there's no immunity in the general population, we're guaranteed that this is very different than the Spanish flu, that quarantine or lockdown won't work. Nobody's responded to this. Everybody just keeps ignoring my point. So, Fate Wind, Azrael, those of you who are in favor of this lockdown, explain to me any reason why I should think it was going to work. Any reason at all. Do you have any reason at all why I think it should work? Nobody's ever given me one. Or they always say, well, we're just trying to flatten the curve. Yes, Spanish flu killed millions. Spanish flu had a substantially higher fatality rate than COVID. Substantially higher. It had a substantially lower incubation period, and everybody who got Spanish flu had symptoms from it. Well, there's nobody. I'm not trying to tell you whether you should or should not stay home. I'm being sensible. I'm saying you should choose that. If you feel that you're high risk, then stay home. It is an invisible enemy. And so invisible, in fact, that our stupid, porous pseudo-quarantine is nothing but purely idiotic, right? We can all agree with this. There's nobody should be disputing this at this point. That given the fact that nobody can establish this is actually going to work, we should all be maybe wearing masks, maybe doing social distancing, but not engaged in a lockdown. We can all agree on that now. There should be nobody who disputes it because it's true. I've established it clearly. I've won this point without any doubt at all. If despite hearing all these powerful, convincing arguments, and despite no one ever being able to answer the question how this is going to work, you are still in favor of the quarantine, then you are engaged in a wickedness. You should not be advocating at all about anything if you cannot accept the truth of these arguments. No, Fate Wind, that's not true. The coronavirus is not 3%. It's 3%. It's not even 3% in the U.S. In the U.S., it's 2%. And that's when we're only testing the most sick people. Think. The general population, shit tons of people have had it with no symptoms. None of those people in the United States have been tested. So what's the actual death rate? What's the actual death rate? But Azrael, worldwide, globally each year, 250 to 500,000 deaths from the flu. There's been 100,000 deaths from COVID in an equivalent period of time. Why are we caring so much about this thing when we react so differently to comparables? Nobody's answered that question. Is this an efficient way to save lives? If we wanted to spend a lot of resources saving lives, would this be an efficient way to do it? Will we get a high number of saved lives for our dollars? No. And are there such a thing as opportunity costs? Of course. In other words, if we were to spend $1 trillion in some other way to save lives, we would save a shit ton more lives than 100,000. Thanks, Big T. Thanks, Keep It Simple, Libra. But see, Fate Wind, you don't get to make your advocacy in your pretend world. You get to make it in the real world. I don't agree that with a better healthcare system, this advocacy would be justified. But regardless, you have to make your advocacy in the real world. Okay, but Azrael, buying time for what? Buying time for what? Buying time for what? Are you actually saving lives or are you just delaying deaths or what? Now, when this quarantine is over and we all go back to business as usual-ish and the virus erupts again, are you going to insist we shut down the whole world economy again? That everybody has to stay... there's some stores I can't go into if I don't have a mask on. Are you fucking kidding me? Life involves some risk. Hospitals in the U.S. get $12,000 for every confirmed COVID death. I mean, from whom? I mean, what will I do? I'll get on the pulpit and say, first of all, I'm deeply sorry that this country has slipped into emotionalism, alarmism, and authoritarianism in response to something that causes some legitimate fear. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. When we overreact to it and we do more harm than we prevent with our actions, then we need to check ourselves. If you are one of the people out there who've been advocating in favor of this quarantine, you need to check yourself. Stop telling everybody else what they need to do. If you're worried about this illness, you isolate. Now, for the rest of us, I need business back as usual ASAP. We're going to have to fucking float this massive stimulus plan because of this incredibly stupid idea that we implemented here. But I guarantee you going forward that policies will be decided on sensibleness. So no more because of a hunch. Never again, talk is cheap. Every one of my policies will be well advocated, well justified, and people like you who oppose it will run into a buzzsaw of truth that they cannot deny. Now, at this point, anybody who's still trying to argue in favor of the quarantine is simply being willfully wicked. And there's no other way to put it. You have nothing to go on. You have nothing. And here's the thing, when remember that anytime you want to justify an advocacy, you need to, before you make the advocacy, you need to ask yourself some questions, basic questions, okay? Number one, do I have inherency? Is there a problem that actually needs solving that won't solve itself that my action will solve, okay? So I'm not making platitudes. I'm saying to you, what you've not established with your inherent, you have established inherency. There is a problem here, okay? No disputing that. And the problem won't solve itself. No disputing that. So you have inherency, okay? I'm walking you through how to make a proper advocacy, okay? Thank you, Cincinnatus. The next thing you have to ask yourself is, what are the harms? So every advocacy has both benefits that you anticipate and also costs. If you're not calculating the costs at all, or the harms, before you make your advocacy, then you shouldn't be making an advocacy. Now, the third thing you need to calculate is significance. Is your advocacy going to make a significant enough difference to justify the costs? And the answer is clearly no. But you didn't do a significance calculus before making your advocacy. The fourth thing that you need to attend to, and this is the most important one, is solvency. These are the four stock elements of any sound case. There's five. The other one is topicality, but topicality is not relevant here because that's specifically for competition debate. But the other four are relevant to any kind of argumentational situation. And you've failed to do any of the things that anybody should always do before you've made an advocacy. You didn't sit down and go, I mean, you do have inherency. That's the only thing you care about. Here's inherency. I mean, Fate Wind, I will give you plenty of policies to slow down this pandemic, okay, that are concrete, except here's the problem. You are assuming your position. This pandemic is a disastrous nightmare to begin with. So the first concrete solution I would have for you is we need to test random swaths of the population so we get accurate data. Number one, okay? Get accurate data is number one, because we cannot possibly make any good advocacies in the absence of adequate data, okay? So I don't want to make the same mistake you're making. I don't want to tell you what we should do before we have adequate data about it. So that's one thing to remember, okay? Now, number two thing I would say is the masks appear to have worked in Taiwan. It's a small enough imposition on people that encouraging everybody nationally to wear masks and allowing the natural no mask shaming FE aspects of the world to provide the leverage or pressure to make people do it is potentially a hugely significant impact. Because if we look at actual data, which we do have, we can look at Taiwan. Now, Taiwan, no quarantine, but much lower rate of infection, lower rate of death than anybody else. Okay, so we know we can imitate Taiwan's use of universal use of masks, and that appears to completely stop the spread of it. So if in fact a counter plan, in other words, a simple advocacy like masks solves the problem without incurring your costs, then we shouldn't do your plan. Okay, that's another thing. Number 3 thing that we could do. I am not personally opposed to the social distancing in general. I think that keeping further away from each other is fine enough. I know 116,038 dead. That's about half as much as the flu has killed in the equivalent period of time. So why don't we shut down the whole world economy every year for the flu? Finessing you for a while. Okay, now the third thing that we can do and probably should do is willfully quarantine those who we know are sick. So if we're quarantining the right people instead of just everybody willy-nilly, well, then we can have an actual impact on things. If you have widespread testing and you actually quarantine people who are actually sick and contagious, then you might have an impact on the spread of the disease. Note, you can't do it successfully by half-assedly quarantining everybody. Doesn't work, remember, because of the nature of the contagion here. So that's 3 things. The 4th thing you could do is pre-quarantine nursing homes. In other words, you have staff that go in there and stay on duty for 2 weeks at a time, like a military deployment. And then the next staff comes in, having been tested day 4, isolated and stuff. Be very particular in your protocols about entries and exits from nursing homes, because those are the most at-risk populations. Okay, a sensible enough approach. Not so costly, is it? Hold on, I've given you now what, 3 or 4 solutions, or four incredibly important factors. Number 1, having the right data. Number 2, emulating Taiwan instead of Russia, where they lock shit down for even more than U.S. did. Well, that's the point, Claire. That's why it won't work. The only problem with that, Derek, is that a person can be infected but should not show symptoms. That's the whole point, Claire. So the quarantine as it's currently being implemented will not work. We know that with a 2-week-long incubation period because of what you just said. We can guarantee it won't work. Okay, so all right, one economic solution? You mean the way for the free market to solve this, or do you mean a solution to the clusterfuck or disaster you created? Because that's a different question entirely. How do we solve this mess you made is a different question than how should we have dealt with this, right? I'm not getting high blood pressure. As far as the free market solving it, I would say, I don't know if the free market can solve this one exactly. I'm not saying government shouldn't be involved. I'm saying there shouldn't be a lockdown. People are getting laid off. What's next? Well, if I'm taking over right now, obviously I've got a big disaster to clean up. I got a huge mess to clean up. As president, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to gather. I'm going to have to spend some time analyzing data and determining where potential action can have a substantial impact on people who are most deserving. Okay, well, you want an economic argument, right? So I'm trying to think of an economic argument. But what you really want is a different kind of argument. You want an argument to what to do now. Well, the answer to that is, I'm in favor of the stimulus, not because I'm in favor of stimuluses, but because I'm in favor of not letting everybody go to shit. Now, granted, the government's not going to save everybody. The fuck it will. They're not giving people enough money. Yeah, I know. Give the money to the businesses that employ those people instead of to the people directly. let them keep paying the employees or something. I don't know. I'm not sure how to respond to this mess. It's a disaster. You've undermined the basic principle of capitalism, which is individual people doing what they want, when they want, where they want, why they want, and not being constrained arbitrarily because a few people find it in their interest to constrain everybody. But that's not true, R. Claire. It's true we don't know who's affected. It doesn't mean the safest solution is to quarantine everybody because you're not accounting for other harms, right? So safety, it's like, listen, I'm afraid that you're going to crash while turning the car. So the solution is to just go straight the whole time. Well, then you're guaranteed to crash. So no, absolutely. The safest solution is not to quarantine everybody. That is not true. I've already established that nobody's proved to me that it's going to have any solvency at all. And nobody's counting the harms. The harms count too, not just the prospective predicted benefits that are vastly overblown and totally out of proportion with reality. But what are you talking about? You're asking a different question now. You're not responding to that. The first question, what ought we do about the quarantine, is one set of questions. I give you 4 reasons for that. Then you want a 5th reason about something else, namely what we should do now that people like you have fucked everything up. Okay, well, that's a tricky question. Do I have a clear answer to that right now? No, I'm still battling this battle. People like you still think there should be a quarantine. We're still in it. It hasn't ended yet. So obviously, that's the battle right now. The first thing I need to do is pay attention to getting us the fuck out of this quarantine by winning the argument over and over again against everybody who comes with all of their respective bullshit and reminding everybody again and again that nobody has answered the question of how the quarantine will work, why we are not guaranteed to just get this virus erupt again after the quarantine, and how long we would have to wait for. People have said vaccine. Well, we don't know how long we're going to have to wait for the vaccine. Nobody's answered questions like, why don't we take comparably severe action to vastly more deadly problems? We lose over 1 million people a year to car crashes. Why don't we ban driving? Because car crashes are contagious. Well, who the fuck cares? Your reason for COVID being so special is that it's going to kill a lot of people, right? Even the biggest reasonable projections don't say it's going to outpace car crashes. So why are we ending the world economy, stop COVID, but have no problem letting everybody in the world drive? And Cincinnati, please, you don't. You've already given me money today twice, and I appreciate it very much. So do you see what I'm saying? When it's like, do I have answers to what policies we should do in response to this current mess? Well, yeah, but I mean, it's like we're not there yet, right? I need to try to minimize the amount of damage you're doing here. You're trying to change the question to, hey, Eric, why don't you already know how to clean up my mess? Well, because I didn't make it. I was opposed to this shit from the very first moment. I was opposed to it. From the very first moment. I have not wavered on that. I've become only more and more certain over time because the data has borne out what I suspected. Had it been the other way around, no, I would have admitted I was wrong and changed my position. None of which are quarantine/lockdown. None of which are forcibly shutting down way more than half the businesses in the state. Those are not acceptable solutions. Those are it's using force and centralized decision making where individual agency ought to be respected. Okay, but Azrael, right, quarantine should be the last resort. My point is, no one's established that this qualifies. It does not have a fatality rate of 10%. This does not kill young people. This is not the sort of thing that we comparably behave towards with comparable examples. And the justification everybody's saying is the saving lives thing. Well, if you want to value saving lives, if you want to value life as a maximal value to uphold, then why are you getting such a shitty deal? You are spending trillions and trillions of dollars to save a comparatively small number of lives versus just about anything else that kills people. So why are you upholding the value of life by getting the world's shittiest deal, spending trillions of dollars, which could save tens of millions of lives, and getting in exchange for it maybe 100,000 or a couple 100,000? Why? Thanks, Fake Wind. Thanks, Cincinnati, for shaming her into it. Well, this turned out to be a good live stream. People super chatting, getting me all riled up and everything. What is my sweater made out of? Okay, well, I didn't give you economic solutions for the reason I said. You're asking me to answer the next question. It's, what is this thing? I don't know. What does that say? I can't read it. I guess I would guess cotton.